The amazing digital circus is days away from its official premiere, and somehow the biggest threat to the experience of watching it was never the story itself, but the community that grew around it. This is not about generalizing or saying every single fan is the problem, because that would be unfair and wrong, since a huge part of this fandom has been genuinely great and has made the show feel like something bigger than just a series. But there are patterns in how this community has behaved over the past few months that, when you add them all up, paint a pretty clear picture of a fandom that helped ruin its own ending in more ways than one. The most obvious place to start is the leak, because nothing did more damage in a shorter amount of time than what happened when a hacker broke into a Brazilian dubbing studio's system, pulled the full film out of it, and put it online for the world to find. The film spread across Reddit, Twitter, and TikTok faster than Glitch could take it down. And the result was that thousands of fans who had been waiting years for this finale were suddenly walking through a minefield every time they opened their phones. Some people saw spoilers without looking for them, others went searching and then felt let down by what they found, and a portion of the audience made up their minds about the ending based on clips taken out of context from a Portuguese dub of a film they had not actually watched from start to finish. That last group then went online and started loudly saying the ending was bad, which shaped how other people felt about the film before they had ever seen a single official frame of it. And the reaction to the leak did not stop at opinions, but also got financial, because people started selling off their entire digital circus collections based on what they had heard about the ending secondhand. And this tweet from someone in the community summed up the moment pretty well. People are selling their whole TADC collections because they didn't like the ending. I feel like a vulture picking through everything, but I did manage to score a completed Jax Nendoroid for less than retail, so a win is a win. Walking away from a show based on a leaked version of its finale before the official release and before you have watched it properly says less about the quality of the ending and more about how fast a fandom can turn on something it once loved when the emotional investment stops feeling safe. And the people spreading those hot takes did real damage, because once a narrative about an ending being bad starts moving on social media, it is very hard to stop, and a lot of people going into that theater on June 4th will already have a version of the ending in their heads that was built on incomplete, out-of-context footage watched through a pirated copy. What makes this even harder to sit with is that the leak itself was already a crime committed against the show, and instead of the community rallying around protecting the experience, a big chunk of it ran toward the fire. There is something genuinely strange about a fandom that spends years building hype for a finale, and then, the moment a broken version of it becomes available, cannot resist watching it early and then going online to tell everyone else how it made them feel. It undercuts the very thing the fandom claimed to want, which was a proper, exciting, shared moment of experiencing the ending together, and it traded that for the immediate satisfaction of being one of the first people to have an opinion about something, even if that opinion was formed under the worst possible conditions. Then, there is the theatrical window, and this one is genuinely more complicated because some of the concerns people raised are real and worth taking seriously. The decision to release the last act in theaters from June 4th to June 18th, with the YouTube and Netflix drop following on June 19th, was not a random call. Glitch CEO explained that the 2-week gap was the result of a real negotiation with the film industry, and getting an independent animated series into over 1,800 theaters worldwide is a genuinely big deal for a show that started as a YouTube pilot. The theatrical run exists partly to show that indie animation can compete at that level, which is good for every creator working in that space, not just Glitch. But parts of the fandom refused to engage with any of that, and instead split into different groups that each found their own reason to be unhappy. Some said indie animation has no place in theaters and belongs on YouTube where it started, and where everyone can watch it free. Others said they liked the idea of a theatrical run, but could not accept the 2-week gap, pointing out that not everyone can afford a cinema ticket, not everyone lives near a theater showing it, and not everyone lives in a country where it is even playing. Others focused on the spoiler problem, arguing that 2 weeks of avoiding social media is not realistic in 2026, and that the risk is not just a tweet you can mute, but a YouTube thumbnail you catch by accident while scrolling, which is enough to ruin the experience without you having done anything wrong. These are all real concerns, and they deserve to be heard, but the way they turned into weeks of sustained anger directed at Glitch made it harder for the studio to build the excitement around what should have been a celebration, and a lot of that energy ended up poisoning the conversation around the release before it even happened. There is also the merchandise situation, which has been a running complaint in parts of the fandom for a while now, with some people arguing that Glitch pushes too many products, too many plushies, too many figures, and that it starts to feel like the show exists to sell things rather than the other way around. That frustration is understandable up to a point, but it gets harder to take seriously when you know that merchandise revenue covers around 80% of what keeps projects like Digital Circus alive and funded. The promotional content is a lot, and that is fair to point out, but it is not the kind of advertising that forces itself on people who just want to watch the show. Since you can watch every episode on YouTube for free without paying anything, and the main reason that is even possible is because enough people bought the plushies. Complaining about the merch while also expecting the show to exist for free is a tension that a part of this fandom never really sat down and thought through. Something else that has been building quietly in the background is a group of people whose only real contribution to the fandom is to show up and leave negative comments, criticize everything Gooseworks does, or insult Glitch for basically any decision they make. Not because they have a genuine point to make, but simply because criticizing something popular is its own kind of entertainment for some people. These are not fans in any meaningful sense of the word, because a fan, even a critical one, comes from a place of caring about the thing they are talking about, while this group seems to show up specifically to tear things down and then move on. The problem is that their comments travel just as far as everyone else's, and when a creator like Gooseworks is already dealing with everything she has been dealing with, having a portion of her mentions be people whose only goal is to make her feel bad about the work she spent years on is the kind of thing that wears a person down in ways that are very hard to see from the outside. The last point is probably the most difficult one to talk about clearly, but it is also the most important, and that is the way parasocial behavior has shaped how this community treats the people behind the show. When a series gets as big as Digital Circus did, the creators and voice actors stop being just people who made a thing you like and start becoming figures that a part of the audience feels personally close to, even though that connection only goes in one direction. That feeling is not bad on its own, because caring about the people behind something you love is a normal part of being a fan. But it crosses a line when it turns into a sense of ownership, when fans feel like they have a right to weigh in on every personal or creative decision a creator makes, when any criticism of the show gets treated as an attack on the whole community, and when the difference between supporting someone and putting pressure on them disappears entirely. The voice actor controversies earlier this year were a good example of how quickly that dynamic can go wrong, since the reaction from parts of the fandom was so intense and so personal that it became its own separate problem on top of the original one. And Gooseworks posting on Blue Sky that she cannot keep her heart in the show anymore is not something that comes out of nowhere, but rather something that builds up over years of being on the receiving end of attention and expectation at a level that most people who just set out to make a cartoon never planned for and never fully signed up for. What is worth thinking about is what it actually feels like to be on the other side of that. Gooseworks did not start Digital Circus knowing it would become a theatrical film with millions of fans worldwide, a Netflix deal, and a fandom that feels entitled to comment on every creative and personal choice she makes. She started it because she had an idea, and Glitch gave her the space to build it. The scale that followed is something she never asked for, and the community that came with that scale brought a version of love that, at its worst, started to look more like a cage than a fan base, where any decision she made was going to be criticized by someone, any statement she put out was going to be picked apart, and any sign that she was struggling as a human being was going to be turned into content by the very people who said they cared about her work. None of this means Digital Circus was not worth it, because it clearly was, and the fact that its finale is still projected to earn between $10 and $17 million in its opening weekend despite the leak and everything else is proof that the show built something real and lasting. But the way this final stretch played out, from the leaks to the backlash to the merch complaints to the negativity to the parasocial pressure, is a clear example of how a fandom can slowly make things harder for the very people and the very work they say they love. The show deserved a better ending than this, and so did Gooseworks. And if this community is willing to be honest with itself, it has to acknowledge that it played a part in how things got to where they are. Do you think the fandom's behavior affected how this finale landed? And looking back at all of it, what do you think could have gone differently? Drop it in the comments, because I genuinely think this community is capable of having that conversation in an honest way.